Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, hello, Bruce Frankel. It
Hello
is
there,
just
Lisa
almost noon. Excuse me. It is almost noon, and so we're going to wait a few more minutes and let some more people join us here today. Thank you for joining us from the lovely International Home Office of the DRC here in Fort Worth, Texas. It is a overcast day and kind of steamy out there today. And so it's right at noon now. And so we're going to go ahead and get started. We'll have some people joining us, I'm sure, as we move along. But today's topic for Housing First Friday is understanding the system. So for those of you joining us, Bruce is going to talk today about how people move out of homelessness into housing here in Tarrant County. And just a few little bits of housekeeping before we start. If you have a question, at the bottom, there's a little Q&A, and I'll try to monitor that as we go along, and we can certainly get your questions in. There's a raise hand. If you want to raise your hand to ask a question, we can do that too. And there's a chat box to where you can type in some to the chat. I'm going to type hello. I'm also going to be putting some links into the chat here in just a second to help you follow along. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Bruce Frankel, and I'm going to pin him in the spotlight. Here you go, Bruce.
Thank you, Lisa. Here I am. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Bruce Frankel, and I'm the Executive Director of DRC Solutions. And you just met Lisa Minone, who is our Director of Communications and Development. And Lisa, thank you very much for setting everything up. And Lisa is the hidden hand behind this online event. And she's done a very good job with it. But anyway, I want to welcome you to this First Friday. And thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to learn more about homelessness. So homelessness is a big issue in our community and every community across America. We have a series of 6 presentations, 6 First Friday talks that we give, and we repeat it twice a year, focusing on various issues of homelessness, sort of taking a deep dive. We believe that an informed citizenry is absolutely essential to addressing this very complicated issue. And today, our issue that we're going to talk about in more detail is really understanding the system. You know, how do we as a community actually address homelessness? Now, one of the things I do want to mention is we are not going to be talking today about why people become homeless or the institutionalized features of our system, local, state, and federal, that does lead people to become homeless. We'll be saving that for another topic. So I might just break in real quickly. My office is right on East Lancaster, in that neighborhood in Fort Worth where many of the homeless services are concentrated. And on any day of the week, at any time of the day, when you drive down here, you'll see a number of men and women, and sometimes children, who are on the streets, who are accessing various services around here. And at night, you'll see people that are sleeping on the streets. And there's lots of ambulances that come and go through this corridor of East Lancaster. So you may hear an ambulance just like you did just a few minutes ago in our broadcast. But anyway, without any further ado, let me talk about the system. So at first glance, it appears as if it's just sort of a chaotic environment of all sorts of people trying to do things for the homeless. There are people that come down here from various congregations that open up the back of their SUVs and start handing out food to people. There are people that are cleaning out their homes and decide that they want to do something nice for people that are homeless. They may come down in this neighborhood and drop off bags of clothing. There are people coming down here that may be ministering to the homeless. There's nothing to prohibit any one of our citizens in Tarrant County and Fort Worth from coming down here in this particular neighborhood and doing what they feel they need to do to help. However, there is a formal system as well. And one of the things that I will request of our citizens is that if you want to help the homeless, the best way of doing that is to work through one of our formally recognized agencies, because we're part of a larger formal system, which we call a continuum of care, that is doing our very best to address homelessness. And this continuum of care is broad. It's driven by a strategic plan that tries to address all the elements of homeless, what people need, how much it'll cost, who can provide that service, who is contracted with to provide that service, to try and help people recover from homelessness as quickly as possible. And I use the word recover because homelessness is not a label that should define someone for the rest of their lives. It's merely a condition that people have found themselves in where they do not have the means or the resources for obtaining and holding on to affordable housing. When that happens, people sometimes, particularly if they don't have family support, may end up without a habitable place to spend the night, and they may end up accessing emergency shelter services or sleeping on the streets or in encampments, at which time we sort of identify those folks as temporarily being homeless. Our job in the system is to find these folks, find out what they need to exit homelessness as quickly as possible, to get people into housing and then support them in housing for as long as it takes for them to become completely self-sufficient and integrated back into our community. So it used to be, going back to the times of the suffrage movement at the turn of the 20th century, over 100 years ago, the model for addressing men and women who were transient and were homeless was what was known as housing readiness. And in a housing readiness model, you may require that people get sober, that people learn a trade, that people do lots of different things to get ready for reentering society and accessing housing. And sometimes that might take 1 or 2 or 3 years or longer. One of the problems with that system is people tended to get stuck in emergency shelters while they were learning a new skill and sobering up, getting healthcare services that they needed, and spent lots of time, sometimes years, in emergency shelters before they were deemed ready to go into housing. It was an expensive model, and it was one that, quite frankly, developed codependencies where people, after time, found it very difficult to leave what they felt was the protected environment of a shelter. And it sort of prolonged people's homelessness. In the early 1990s, beginning in New York City, there was a movement called Housing First. And it was based on sound clinical research that found that if we house people first and then wrap services around them, that 1, it was less expensive, 2, people's duration of homelessness was significantly reduced. But more important, we found that while people were living on the streets or in the shelters, their anxiety levels were very, very high, as were high levels of depression in response to trauma. And those conditions created barriers to people recovering from homelessness. We put people in housing first, they immediately feel more secure, where they can be in their own bedroom, they can lock their own front door, they can live in an environment that's peaceful and quiet, safe and secure. Did a lot towards better mental health for people. And we found that people recovered from homelessness much more rapidly. We also found that people's symptoms around drinking and depression and anxiety dropped considerably once we took people off the streets and put them in housing, which made them much more receptive to long-term drug and alcohol treatment, long-term behavioral health care treatment, and long-term treatment for chronic health conditions. So all in all, housing first model had much, much better clinical outcomes. Two, it had a much more positive impact on the community because we were more quickly able to get people off the streets and into housing rather than waiting months or years while people became ready for housing. So we put housing first and then wrap services around them. This is the new way of addressing homelessness, and everybody in our continuum of services down here looks at housing first really as kind of the gold standard in addressing homelessness and strategies for helping people recover from homelessness. We also find, and our units of local government and you as citizens should be happy to hear this, that housing first model is less expensive than people staying long-term in emergency shelters. So it becomes an economically preferred strategy for addressing homelessness as well. And I might add that the DRC is one of the leading proponents of what's known as the housing first model. In fact, probably about 10 years ago, we started to change our model to focus almost exclusively on a housing first model and a housing first philosophy. So there's lots of different agencies that are providing services to the homeless. In most communities, people recognize that there's some sort of a nighttime shelter that provides services. And when you ask most people, how is your community, or how do you believe our community is addressing homelessness? Most people will say, well, we've got a nighttime shelter and people are homeless, they go there. Well, that's one element of our continuum of care. So I use this term continuum of care in two ways. One is every community in the United States who wants to apply for and draw down government dollars, federal government dollars from housing and urban development. And these are the dollars at the national level that are devoted to addressing issues of homelessness. We have to demonstrate that our community has what's known as a continuum of care. That is a continuum of organizations that can meet all the different needs for getting people off the streets and into housing, and then to continue to support them. And then the agencies that can do that join a continuum. It's almost like a trade association. We pay dues. As a group, we set up a database that allows us to capture daily census of how many people in our community are homeless, what types of services people are receiving. It's very similar to a healthcare system where you get a card and it identifies you as a user of that system. And whenever you use that system, it captures information on the resources that you use and what you need. So we have something very similar for addressing homelessness. So as people fall into homelessness, they are directed to our continuum of care where they can register in that system and receive a card that's very similar to a healthcare card. And once they're in the system, they can access for free any of the services that any of the continuum of care agencies offer, from case management to behavioral health care to primary health care to an array of housing options. And this continuum of care, every year we put together a collaborative application for housing and urban development to help offset the cost of subsidized housing for placing homeless people into housing. And in our community, we draw down $14–15 million a year through this. Okay, I've just gotten a little note. I've got a question. Let me just see that. Do I have a question, or were you just letting people know, Lisa, that if they do have a question? Okay, I don't see any hands up, so I'm assuming that we don't have any questions. Hold on, let me get.
Sorry, I was just reminding everybody that if they had a question to put it in the chat box. So sorry about that, Bruce.
All right, well, hold on. I'm off. I gotta get back to where we are here. Okay, how come I can't see a video here? So Lisa, you're gonna have to help me. Okay, never mind, it's back on. Okay, sorry.
We're back. Yay. Okay.
A little bit of a technical issue there. So
we're good. We're good.
Yeah. Okay, great. So anyway, so we've got this continuum of care. And in our community, there's a lead agency for the continuum of care called the Tarrant County Homeless Coalition. And all of our agencies that have a major role in providing homeless services are part of that continuum. And the DRC is a major participant in the continuum. So all of our major nighttime shelters, Center for Transforming Lives, Salvation Army, Union Gospel Mission, Presbyterian Night Shelter, they're also part of the continuum, as are such agencies like Samaritan House, and probably half a dozen other agencies. John Peter Smith is part of the continuum, MHMR of Tarrant County, any of our large agencies that have significant roles in addressing homelessness through services or policy are part of this continuum. So together, the continuum gets about $14 million in federal money, but locally, we also pull down probably another 10 or $15 million in local and state dollars to help address homelessness. So the continuum coordinates a lot of money and coordinates the activities of all these agencies so that we've got a smooth and continuous way of addressing homelessness from the moment people become homeless and addressing what they need to the moment where people exit homelessness and into housing, and then what they need to maintain that housing. Our continuum has been fully functional now for over 15 years and really does, I believe, a very good job. At least once a year, there's a large strategic plan that's developed and updated that addresses what our community needs to help people recover from homelessness. Now, the continuum of care covers all of Tarrant County and parts of Parker County. So it's a large catchment area that our continuum of care addresses. More locally, at the city of Fort Worth, where approximately 85% of the folks that are homeless access services in Tarrant County, the city of Fort Worth also has a special homeless services department and a homeless services director. And they work very closely with the larger continuum of care to be sure that the two systems, the city system and the more broad county-based continuum of care, work very closely in a very coordinated way so that local dollars are leveraged very well to be sure that there's not duplication of effort, to be sure that your taxpayer dollars are spent in a way that's most efficient, and probably more important, a way that people that are accessing services because they've become homeless, because there's such good coordination between the city and the county continuum of care, we rarely see people drop through the cracks. So one of the things that's part of the system that helps to ensure that people don't fall through the cracks is when people become homeless, they can they can talk to anybody at the city or the county level about help, I need help. The first thing they're directed to do is to go to East Lancaster to a building that is managed by Presbyterian Night Shelter called True Worth, and there they can register in the continuum of care as a a client that needs service, and they get entered into the system, and they get a little card. And again, it's like when you enroll in the healthcare system, it's people enrolling in the service system for accessing and obtaining services if they're homeless. So the way people get into the system, there's a front door, just like there is when you enroll in your healthcare provider, and we call it coordinated entry. So when you enter into the system, and you can enter into the system through any one of our agencies, but we ask people when they're new to the system to go to True Worth Place. Once you're in the system, all the different entities in the coordinate or the continuum of care can access parts of your data through coordinated entry. The other thing that coordinated entry does is it ensures that people who are homeless have fair and equal access to community services. So one of the first things that happens when someone becomes homeless is, as they're entered into the system, they meet with a case manager who asks them a lot of questions, and then helps to assess their severity of need. So once you're in coordinated entry, based on your severity of need, even though you may be brand new to the system, you might go to the top of the list for things like healthcare, behavioral healthcare, or housing, because your need is so great. So coordinated entry not only ensures that people have fair and equal access to resources, but it helps to collect data from people coming into the system to evaluate their level of severity so that those people with the most need can get the proper intervention they need at that particular time. And it's probably good to mention right now that many people who enter into the system self-resolve on their own. You know, their severity might be low or their capabilities may be very high. Now, when we talk about severity, who are the most severe people in the system, these are the people that we refer to as the chronically homeless, people that have been homeless a long time because they have some sort of a disability, which creates extreme barriers and hardships to them being able to support themselves, obtain food, healthcare, and housing. We prioritize these people because we know that without our help, they're not going to be able to self-resolve their homelessness on their own. So there's a lot of agencies. I think there's probably about 38 agencies now in the continuum of care. And again, we all have a particular role. We all get paid for that. We all have to collect data to show that we're obtaining the outcome that we have hoped to obtain, that is people getting into housing and recovering from homelessness. But we as a system also, through this continuum of care, collect impact data. We want to know how what we're doing to address homelessness is impacting the overall community's perception that homelessness is becoming less disruptive and is becoming less visibly noticeable in our communities. You know, we as a community don't want to look like San Francisco or LA, where there's tens of thousands of homeless people on the street camping, or many very ill people wandering the streets with severe mental illness. We don't want that for our communities. So the continuum of care is well coordinated to be sure that we try to address that as best as possible. And one of the things that helps is through the continuum of care, collecting impact data. So the continuum of care are not the only groups that are trying to address homelessness, right? There are no special licensing that people need to get to become a service provider. So we hope people will join the continuum so that things are well coordinated. But we see lots of people down here on East Lancaster and in other neighborhoods who just take it upon themselves, decide to do something about homelessness. And it may have good impact. Sometimes it doesn't have such good impact. It might be disruptive. Sometimes people come down here or decide to start their own little agency and come down here without hooking up to the larger system and make promises to people they can't keep. And that's kind of tragic for people that may be experiencing homelessness, to expect some sort of a resource or outcome only to find they're working with a group that kind of, decided just spur of the moment come down here and really don't have the means to do what they said they're going to do about helping people exit homelessness. People come down here a lot to hand out food, to hand out clothing. Sometimes that's very helpful if it's coordinated through the continuum of care. Sometimes it's not so helpful if it leaves a mess of things on the streets, empty pizza boxes, stale food that's lying around, piles of wet, soggy clothing. A lot of the mess that we sometimes see in the streets, not necessarily a product of someone that's homeless. It's a product of someone that's trying to do the right thing by helping people, but then not fully thinking the impact that they might be having on the local area if what they're doing is not well coordinated. So for those people that do have an interest in doing something, instead of just going out and deciding you're going to end homelessness on your own, we really encourage you to call Tarrant County Homeless Coalition, which again is our lead agency in our continuum of care, and ask them how you can get tied into the system to help. You might want to help as an individual, or maybe you want to start your own nonprofit. Let us help you. Let us be sure that if you want to come in and help, that you're not duplicating efforts or doing things that aren't needed. That's really the way to be helpful, is to become part of that system. So we also have other large elements in our community that are addressing either the impact of homelessness or trying to address the outcome of homelessness for individuals by helping them end their homelessness. So we have, our business community does quite a bit in working with our continuum of care and our units of local government to try to mitigate the disruptive elements of homelessness in our business corridors, like in downtown Fort Worth, a group called Downtown Fort Worth Inc. And Sundance Square they have hired resources to help people who may end up in the downtown area and are homeless, may be lost, need direction on how to access services, or they may be disruptive. So the business community is working very closely with our continuum of care to try to address homelessness in various neighborhoods. We also have, a couple dozen neighborhood associations throughout Fort Worth, and they're all concerned about homelessness, and they work very closely with the police department and their neighborhood patrol officers to try to identify where there may be homeless people in the various neighborhoods or camping in parks and stuff like that, trying to help direct resources to those people. And then we have our faith-based community. We've got several hundred congregations just in Fort Worth alone. But what's most visible are the large congregations like First Presbyterian Church or UCC or Broadway Baptist or First United Methodist. They have standalone homeless missions of their own. Some of them are located on site at the churches where people can go to get food or clothing. Some are standalone units that might be located elsewhere, like First Street Mission. And these are all faith-based initiatives. And they also work very closely with the continuum of care. And some of those large faith-based organizations, large congregations, are actually members of the continuum of care and have made significant contributions towards projects for building housing and helping people get into housing. So we've got a lot of people, and I haven't even touched bases on our units of local government, which I think I'm going to do right now. So in our continuum of care, Fort Worth is most impacted by homelessness. About 85% of the people that are homeless in Tarrant County during the course of any one year are getting services or are camping or coming through or staying in Fort Worth. And the reason for that is the urban areas have most of the resource, but also people tend, when they become homeless, they tend to stick around to their home communities. And since Fort Worth has the largest population base, it makes sense that we're going to have the largest number of people that may be experiencing homelessness. So our Fort Worth unit of government, our mayor, our city council members, our city manager's office are all very much involved in helping to address homelessness. As I said, the city of Fort Worth has their own homeless services department, and the mayor and the city council are very involved in understanding, being educated on the issues, and helping, or actually working with the continuum of care to develop policies for Fort Worth and how Fort Worth is going to address homelessness. The smaller municipalities, Arlington, there's probably about 100, 150 people that are homeless in Arlington on any one day. Not quite as big as Fort Worth, where that number is probably about 2,000 a day. But Arlington also has a very active presence in our continuum of care, and they have some significant providers there. Mission Arlington, a couple of others that provide emergency shelter, that provide the case management to help people get into housing. And they're part of the continuum of care as well. There's also a coordinated effort through the continuum of care to be sure that all the local municipalities in Tarrant County, and that one little section of Parker County, and I think it's 14 or 15 local municipalities, all have access and all have a means to voice their issues and concerns around homelessness, and to be sure they're participating in the continuum of care, to be sure that resources are available to address the issues of homelessness in their particular city. And I think of places like Weatherford, or I think of places like Hearst, or we've mentioned Arlington, Bedford, Euless, Southlake, Colleyville, Grapevine. All of these municipalities are also within the catchment of the continuum of care and have the opportunity to join the continuum, and their units of local government have policy access to the continuum as well. Another element of our continuum of care at the units of local government is the state. The state of Texas, through Health and Human Services Department, manages a lot of federal dollars that come directly to the state, and some state general revenue dollars that's set aside for addressing homelessness, and that is coordinated through our continuum of care as well. So we have local, cities, municipalities, we've got state, and we've also got the federal government with housing and urban development, all working in concert through our continuum of care to be sure that our community can draw down the maximum amount of dollars to address the issues of homelessness, and that through this continuum of care that we can all sit down and work at developing very thoughtful policies and strategies for quickly identifying people that are experiencing homelessness and quickly giving them just the resource they need to quickly resolve their issues of homelessness. Now, as I said, for many people, they can self-resolve with just a little bit of help, maybe a couple of months free rent, maybe access to some food, maybe some help in getting a car fixed and getting back on their feet, getting back to work and back in the workforce. About a third of the people self-resolve that way. Other people may need a little more assistance, and then some people may need lifetime assistance. Again, this is all coordinated through the continuum of care and the agencies that have been identified to perform certain functions to be sure we're most effective. So let me just quickly go over again the journey that people experience when they become homeless it's really complicated. And you can understand why agencies like the DRC and other agencies that are members of the continuum hire lots of case managers to help people move through the system, because it's kind of a bureaucratic nightmare. So the journey starts with someone losing their housing, whether it's through eviction or through the breadwinner might have died or abandoned the family. There's lots of different ways why people become homeless. People lose their jobs, people get sick, people get injured. And what happens is people are directed to any one of the agencies in the continuum of care, where they can go there and say, I need help, and then they'll immediately get assisted in registering in the system. That's where it all begins. Next, once people are registered in the system, a case manager will sit down with them and do 2 assessments. And this helps to determine what the person needs and how quickly we can get resources to them. There's a HUD assessment, and it determines how long someone's been homeless, whether they have a disability, what their income is, what their history is, whether or not they are tied into any mainstream benefits. It really asks people a lot of questions to determine exactly what they have and what they don't have. And then more locally, we do what's known as, it's an acronym, but I'm going to say it once, I'll never say it again, the VI SPDAT. And it's basically an assessment tool that's more in-depth than the HUD assessment. And it helps us to evaluate people's healthcare needs, criminal history, how much trauma they might be experiencing at the moment. It does a much deeper assessment. It allows us to prioritize people in terms of who needs immediate assistance and what do they need. So we do these assessments, and then based on the assessment, people are put on a list that's updated every 2 weeks that all of our agencies look at to determine who's on that list and what. So, and as we provide services to people, all these data continue to be entered and updated in what's known as the Homeless Management Information System. That's where all this information is kept. And the best way to, again, to understand this is to think of your experiences in enrolling in a healthcare system. You have to answer a lot of questions on conditions, pre-existing conditions, income, all that type of stuff. Then you enroll in the system, and then you get a card. And whenever you get sick, you can go to places that your healthcare providers say are approved providers. And you can show them that card. And while you may have to pay a co-payment, most of the cost of what you need is going to be covered after a doctor or someone else meets with you, assesses what you might need, and then prescribes what you need. Same thing happens in our homeless management information system. All those data are collected. The only difference when people access services through our continuum is they don't have to pay a copay. It's all free. So there, people that might be worried about, well, I need to get homeless services, but I don't have a way to pay for it. You don't have to worry about that. It's all covered. So once people enter into the system, then there's a list that's generated every 2 weeks that goes out to the agencies that are doing housing placement or addressing other needs. And case managers will go out and find you. Now, people who are homeless are not just sitting in one place. Some of these folks are in the nighttime shelters. Some of these folks may be couch surfing. Some of them may decide to go to Dallas for a couple of weeks and then maybe come back. Many of these people are camping all throughout Fort Worth and Tarrant County. So the first step, once people are in the system and their name comes up on the list that says, hey, your level is so acute, we want to reach out to you to get you into housing as quickly as possible. First step there is is that list of people that's generated every 2 weeks is given to an agency that does mobile outreach. And the DRC is one of the primary agencies that does that. So our case managers who do mobile outreach, they get a list of names and we start tracking those people down. And once we find those people, then we help them with the paperwork necessary for them to either to get whatever service they may need. Mostly we're focusing on housing first. So that's the first thing we address. We help these people get hooked up with different agencies that have housing programs and vouchers and open spaces. We help people fill out all the application forms. We help resolve any type of barriers that may exist to people being able to lease an apartment. A lot of different stuff is done at that point. Once that's done, people then are assigned to different agencies that have housing programs or have vouchers that allow people to go out and find their own housing and then use the vouchers. And we're hoping at this point that it's just a few days, maybe just a couple of weeks before people are placed into housing. Now, for people that need housing immediately and may not necessarily have acute needs, we have what's known as rapid rehousing programs where we can immediately provide people with the money to cover 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months worth of rent while people get back on their feet. So we have lots of different ways to help people. Then once people get into housing, they're assigned a housing case manager. And that case manager may work for a number of different agencies in the continuum because we share a lot of these tasks and responsibilities. But once people are assigned that housing case manager, that housing case manager's role is to be sure that they stay in housing. So people will stay in housing if they are able to meet their needs for food, if they're able to meet their need to work or do something meaningful during the day, all those things. So there's a lot of different activities that those housing case managers do to ensure people stay into housing. Like if people are chronically homeless and may be in what's known as permanent supported housing, the case manager assures that all the necessary assessments are done so that that person can have long-term subsidized housing. If the person has short-term needs, they're evaluated on a more short-term basis for how long do you need this to ensure that they have a temporary place to stay. That case manager is also evaluating people's ongoing healthcare needs. You can't stay in housing if all of a sudden you get sick and it impairs your ability to work. We want to be sure to head off those types of barriers early. So we assess people's health and get them into healthcare. We assess people's behavioral health care needs, whether people have mental illness or drug and alcohol addiction that may prove to be detrimental to them staying in long-term housing. We have to address that as quickly as possible. And also for those people that are capable of working, helping to get them to get back into the workforce as quickly as possible. Also during that time, if people have family members that they might be estranged from, but if we could sort of smooth over the differences between this individual and their family, we hope the family may take these people back into the core family area and the family will care for people. And we've been quite successful in doing what we call family reunification. So all this stuff occurs once people enter the system. But as I said, our first priority based on data from over 20, almost 25 years now, is to get people into housing first, then stabilize their health care and their needs for food, behavioral health care needs, and then work on more long-term strategies for helping people fully recover from homelessness and become self-sufficient and independent. So that's kind of how the system works. So you may be asking, well, how long does all this take to end someone's homelessness? Are we talking about months? Are we talking about years? We find, because remember, we collect all this data through our continuum of care through the homeless management information system, we have all this data that can be analyzed. And we found that in Tarrant County, in our continuum of care here, that even the most severely involved person takes approximately 60 days from the time someone enters the system and says, help, I need housing, to fully housed. It can take upwards of 60 days. In some cases, it may only take a few weeks. In others, it might be a little bit longer, but the average is about 2 months. And for that person experiencing homelessness, that could be an excruciating 2 months. We do understand that. And we're constantly, not just the DRC as an agency on our own, but our continuum of care is constantly looking and reevaluating, analyzing data, and speaking to people that we're working with on discovering ways and new strategies for being able to shorten the time it takes to get people off the streets and into housing. So it used to be, and I've been in this system now for 30 years here in Fort Worth, well, 36 years in Fort Worth, and before that the Bay Area. But it used to be here in Fort Worth, when we talked about people recovering from homelessness, we were talking sometimes in years, where even as recent as 15 years ago, there were people that had been living in the shelters for 5, 10, or 15 years. We don't see that anymore. I mean, everybody recognizes the need of shortening people's stay, that the shelters are not a permanent solution to homelessness, but merely just an emergency resource until people get housed. So we're constantly looking at ways, how do we shorten people's duration of experiencing homelessness? So we've gone from months and months, and in some cases years, to a few weeks to maybe 30 to 60 days. So I think we've made significant progress, even though 60 days of being homeless sounds like it's awful, and it is for that individual. It's much better by a factor of 10 to 20 than it was even just 15 years ago. So what are some of the barriers to quickly placing people in housing? Probably the number one barrier is we could place more people in housing, and we could more rapidly place people in housing if there were more housing units, right? The more housing units we have, the more affordable housing units we have, the more quickly we can place people into housing. So a number of strategies that we have in place is a continuum to try to create more and more affordable housing. One is whenever a developer builds an apartment complex, they can get tax credits. In other words, they can reduce their tax load for up to 15 years, I believe, if they set aside a few units that are affordable, that we can actually afford to rent through some of the subsidy dollars we get for people that are homeless. That's kind of a slow trickle. More recently, and probably one of the silver linings of the whole COVID mess we've lived through the last year and a half is that there have been a lot of relief dollars that have gone to local and state entities. And here in Fort Worth, several $100 million in COVID relief dollars. Some of those dollars have been set aside to help us quickly do new housing starts and building small, unobtrusive apartment communities of 24 to 48. And use the example of Palm Tree, which is a program that the DRC provides case management for, that was a renovation project by the Paulus Foundation. Another is there's a nonprofit called New Leaf that was started with $1 million grant from First Presbyterian Church to build a 48-unit fourplex complex community that the DRC is also providing case management for. And the city used COVID dollars probably about 6 months ago to purchase with our local housing authority a 109-unit hotel that was converted into studio apartments and placed people. And that was done in approximately 3 months. It was very rapid. So we're doing what we can to, as quickly as possible, develop more and more affordable housing options and units in our community. And I believe that our mayor and our city council and our county judges are firmly behind the impetus and good strategies for building more affordable housing. With more affordable housing, we can place more people that are homeless, and we can do so more quickly. Some other barriers, and this is more where case managers come in and help mitigate some of these barriers. If someone has a history of evictions, and we're going to be, they're going to be entering into a standard lease agreement. Sometimes if you have an eviction, you need to develop arguments for providing exceptions so that people that have had evictions can more readily rent, because oftentimes it's a big barrier to being able to get back into housing. Lack of transportation is a big issue. Like there's public transportation in Fort Worth. Anybody who's ever taken the bus knows it's not a very comfortable, sometimes not particularly reliable, nor speedy alternative to having your own car. Unfortunately, many people that are homeless do not. Maybe 2 or 3% of the folks that we work with have their own transportation. So for us being able to develop alternate transportation opportunities, we also purchase every month hundreds of bus passes so that we can help people use public transportation as best they can. But it does tend to slow down our ability to place people. Also, when we place people in housing, we need to place them someplace close to a bus line if they don't have their own transportation. One of the big problems that lack of transportation presents is that there's no integrated transportation system in Tarrant County. So oftentimes here in Fort Worth or in Tarrant County, our options for placing people in housing are limited to Fort Worth because that's where there's a bus system. It's not like we're going to place a lot of people, in Hearst. Or in Arlington, because there's just no transportation. Once people are in their apartment, they need a way to get to the grocery store. They need a way to get to their doctor's appointments. They need a way to get to work if they're working. And if there's no public transportation, it's a huge barrier to placing people in housing outside of the core area of Fort Worth. Sometimes a barrier is finding someone, right? Someone is in our system. They come up on that list that's generated every 2 weeks saying, we've got everything lined up. We can get you in housing now. We can't find them. People that are experiencing homelessness, there's really nothing that's really different from you and I. The quality of our existence is quite a bit different, but a lot of the other things are the same. So, people move around, right? We find that the people that are experiencing homelessness may go and visit someone for a couple of weeks outside the area, or they may decide they want to go stay in Dallas for a month or two. So sometimes we have a hard time finding people because they've left the area. Another barrier is lack of documentation. We cannot get people into housing because we use standard housing leases, rental leases, if people don't have a Texas ID. So one of the first things we do when people enter into the homeless system, one of the questions is do you have, a form of Texas recognized identification? If you don't, we work very quickly and very hard to be sure that we can get a proper documentation for you. And oftentimes that means going out and finding a person, helping them get the birth certificate, social security card, and then we can get Texas ID for them. Sometimes people have a criminal background that precludes them getting into housing. We've been able to mitigate a lot of the criminal background, but people that have violent physical offenses, particularly domestic violence, are not eligible for housing in our system right now, nor are people that have a history of predatory sexual offenses. Final barrier is lack of communication, particularly amongst those people that might have a chronic condition We do work with people that are blind, people that are deaf. We work with people that may have cognitive disorder, which are all barriers to communication. So what we found over the years is agencies like the DRC were hiring more and more highly qualified and trained licensed professionals that come into our system with the types of skills of communicating with people that may have a communication barrier. So these are all the things. Now, one of the things that I had a question come up recently, the state of Texas passed a law outlawing camping. And will this become a barrier to us working with the homeless in our community? The law is still being evaluated. It's supposed to take effect September 1st. There are conditions in that law that if the local community, is working to develop alternatives to people staying on the streets, that those become priority, and we can cut people a little bit of slack. Though our community is not going to allow high concentration of camping like you might see in Austin or San Francisco. But how this may create additional barriers to finding people if they start, dispersing because they can't camp, is yet to be seen. I just don't know how to answer that, but it's something that our entire continuum of care is aware of. And we are already starting to sit down and talk about the different types of things we need to be evaluating and assessing over the first 6 months of the next fiscal year beginning September 1 to see how the impact of that law, how it may create barriers. Maybe it won't. We don't know. We don't think it's going to be too far off from what we currently do. We don't have a huge camping problem in Fort Worth. And when there are concentrated camps, code and Fort Worth PD and the agencies from the continuum of care are quick to get people into alternate housing and to disperse so that these camps don't become public safety issues. So what can you do? And then I'm going to wrap this up real quickly. Well, if the lack of affordable housing is the #1 barrier to people recovering from homelessness, you can become an advocate by saying no to NIMBY. So NIMBY is that philosophy of, oh yeah, everybody needs housing, but I don't want you doing it in my backyard. You can do it in everybody's neighborhood, but don't develop affordable housing here. We need to think broader than that. We need to embrace solutions to homelessness as taking a village. A village is going to have to address this. Your voice is important, but also your open-mindedness is important as well. Invest in the solutions. There's lots of ways that you can give your money or your time. If you can do so through agencies that are part of the continuum of care, that you're going to be working with agencies that are held accountable, that are part of a very well thought out strategy for addressing homelessness, and knowing that we'll be doing things and collecting data on what we do to show that what we do is effective, not just for the individual, but cost effective for the citizens whose taxpayer dollars are paid for all this. Also, continuing, and I applaud you for participating today, continue to participate in information center sessions like this. Ask lots of questions. There's no wrong question. Sometimes there are wrong answers, but there's no wrong question. And I want you all to feel emboldened to ask sometimes the tough questions, not just of agencies like the DRC and our continuum of care, but your elected officials as well about what are you doing to address homelessness? How is it working? What are the outcomes? What are the impacts in our community? Anyway, we're right at 1 o'clock. And I wanted to thank you all so much for participating. You are free to contact us at any time. You can go to our website at drc-solutions.org. There is some information that you've received together with this session where you can contact Liesl Manone. and you can contact Bruce Frankel. We are your two sources of information. You can either email us, or you can call us on our cell phones, or text us is even a better way. But we're here to answer questions. We feel that the investment in an informed community is one of the very best things that we can do to help reduce barriers to good strategies for addressing homelessness, and help to be sure that people receive humane services and their time in homelessness is resolved as quickly as possible. So thank you all very much, and I hope you all have a very good weekend.
Thank you, Bruce. It is right at 1 o'clock. If you guys have any questions, go ahead and type those in real quickly. You got 2 seconds. I'm going to give you 10 seconds actually to type in questions. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up. Thank you all for joining us today. Next month's session is August, and it is one of our most popular ones where you will gasp at some of the information that you learn. It is about available and affordable housing and the lack thereof. So thank you, Bruce. And thank you, everyone. Y'all have a great day.
Yeah, thank
Bye-bye.
you all so much. Bye.